Welcome to Barovia. I can't. I can't actually talk with these in. But you get the point. Everyone who's played D&D has heard of Curse of Strahd, and most of you have probably played it. A horror-infused tale of gothic vampire drama full of werewolves, family curses, and impenetrable banks of mist. But where did Ravenloft come from? How did it get so popular? And why has it appeared in every edition since AD&D? Curse of Strahd was the 6th adventure released for 5e right after Out of the Abyss and Princes of the Apocalypse, but it seems to be the only one of those early adventures people still talk about. All 3 feature classic D&D scenarios right out of 2nd edition, from the evil plots of Demogorgon to the threat of elemental evil. So if all 3 were built on classics and rode the high of the new edition, what makes Strahd so special? Is it the mystique of vampires and eerie dark castles? The cultural pull of Dracula and the castle on the hill? Well, as it turns out, the real answer to how we ended up with Curse of Strahd is a lot more complicated. So let's sink our fangs into a story that harkens all the way back to the heyday of D&D. The year is 1978, Halloween is out in theaters, and everyone has just started to learn how to do the YMCA. But in Salt Lake City, Utah, husband and wife Tracy and Laura Hickman are penciling their first draft of Curse of Strahd. Tracy had recently had a disappointing game of D&D, and was getting increasingly frustrated with some of the limitations of the basic dungeon crawler version of D&D. During a session, the question had come up: why is there a vampire in the middle of this dungeon? They'd been fighting goblins, skeletons, and oozes, but how did this vampire even get down there? You see, up to this point, most of the time when you bought an adventure, you were mostly buying the dungeon, an assembly of rooms and fights meant to accrue gold and loot, but usually not interested in what exactly the larger evil scheme was, besides a paragraph or two, with a few notable exceptions. So the Hickmans set out to make a vampiric villain with all the fleshed out detail of a fantasy antagonist. Over the next 5 years, Tracy and Laura kept making changes and played it with friends every Halloween. Eventually, they caught the attention of TSR, the original D&D company, and they adapted it to Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. This version was titled Ravenloft, and it had a lot of the features that people love about its modern descendant. It was full of gothic horror and featured the swirling mists that guarded its borders. The Taroka deck went by Fortunes of Ravenloft and made each adventure different from the last. Strahd was a real villain, a BBEG, with cause for being there and allies and adversaries that were based in the world, not just the dungeon. Most impressively for the time, it had awesome isometric maps that made the castle feel exciting and not too confusing. The Hickmans had taken a bold step outside of the norm of D&D adventures and struck gold. Ravenloft was a huge success, and brought a lot of new and exciting things into the world of D&D. Many people credited it with launching the more story-driven style of adventures that are now so popular. It was also praised for a sharp, concise plot that was easy to run and kept the players hooked. The adventure has been a long-time feature on best of lists, both from professionals and amateurs for decades, and its influence can be felt in a lot of modern adventures. But we're still left with some questions when we look at what makes up Curse of Strahd. Where do we get the demi-planes of dread and the maniacal dark powers dishing out strange justice by imprisoning things there? Irina's in the original, but the Dr. Rudolf von Richten is notably absent. To find these vital additions, we need to look beyond the works of the Hickmans and take a peek at what came next. As with any company that strikes gold, TSR jumped at the chance to make use of the popularity of Ravenloft to build up momentum. Over 84 products that tied into Ravenloft, Strahd, and Barovia would follow. Over 107 if we're counting the novels. Most of them were released in the next 10 years. 3 years later, a sequel was released titled Ravenloft 2, The House on Griffin Hill. But because of some disputes with TSR, the Hickmans ended up leaving the project. As a result, their outline was used by a new team to finish the adventure to mixed success. The first really big shift came in 1990 with the campaign setting Ravenloft Realm of Terror, which brought the world of Ravenloft into a full campaign setting. It was popular enough to be revised in 1994 and 1997. Oh yeah, revised books are not a new thing in D&D. This is where we get the slightly confusing but awesome addition that Ravenloft is not just the cursed country Strahd is in charge of. Instead, Ravenloft is a kaleidoscope of planar prisons, each holding a villain from history in an eternal loop of petty cruelties inspired by their own wickedness. Strahd is now stranded in Barovia, although, confusingly, the castle is still called Ravenloft. There are some details that just never quite shook out. With this huge world-building addition and the unsettling realities of the Dark Powers moving behind them, we're almost all the way to the world of 5e Curse of Strahd. But there are some other twists and turns that show us why the Ravenloft edition was so popular. As we head off into the Ravenloft of the mid-90s, it's important to keep something in mind. TSR is going broke. Their game is a great success, spawning video games and spin-offs galore, but Gary Gygax had managed to squander a lot of money in his attempt to ostracize his co-creator, Dave Arneson. Don't even get me started. And there's an increasing number of ill-fated new ventures and projects that he's leading. Besides those issues, it can be hard enough to make money on a game where so many people make their own adventures and worlds. One thing that was working, however, was Ravenloft. After the setting's initial 1990 release, a torrent of Ravenloft products released, 8 or 9 adventures or supplements in the setting every single year. And that's alongside everything else that D&D came out with. This eventually gets us the monster expert Rudolf von Richten, and tie-ins with other famous evildoers like Vecna in Vecna Reborn. However, the specter of debt couldn't hold out forever. And on April 10th, 1997, TSR was bought by Wizards of the Coast. Once Wizards of the Coast gets the reins of D&D, things slow down dramatically. After watching TSR stretch themselves too thin, Wizards is happy to slow up the pace. Wizards ended up licensing out the Ravenloft setting in the first few years, and so from 2001 to 2005, the 2 Ravenloft products that came out were by a third-party company and weren't super well received. In 2006, a quick visit gets paid in Expedition to Castle Ravenloft, but progress stalls again when 4th edition hits for its 6-year run. With the exception of the Fair Barovia adventure in Dungeon Magazine, nothing else gets published. During this whole stretch of events, publishing starts to look more like the hardcover books released for 5e, and less like the pamphlet-style books of 2nd edition. And so, it isn't that surprising that we don't return again until D&D 5th edition. When 5e's time came, Wizards jumped off right away with classic adventures that called back to the big bads of Dungeons & Dragons. The adventures weren't all the best reviewed, but the lineup was impressive. Hoard of the Dragon Queen and Rise of Tiamat were sprawling adventures that followed the Dragon Queen's cult getting up to their usual shenanigans. Princes of the Apocalypse made reference to the classic Temple of Elemental Evil, and Out of the Abyss saw our heroes face off against Menzoberranzanian cultists and demons of the Abyss, all the way up to Demogorgon itself. So it wasn't that surprising when it broke that a return to Ravenloft was in the works. But this was a delicate operation. To be fully transparent, the other adventures weren't doing so well. From formatting issues to pacing problems, 5e seemed to be really struggling to find its feet. Somewhere in that situation, however, an outstanding idea bubbled up. If the Hickmans could do it the first time, why not get them to do it this time? It turns out that despite Tracy Hickman's success with Dragonlance and the somewhat bitter finale to the story, the Hickmans had been running Ravenloft in nearly annual sessions for friends and family since its release. That's a solid 33 years of Strahd. In interviews, they've mentioned over the years that they've added lots of new encounters and characters. So, when they were consulted on the new book, plenty of ideas followed, along with a new vision for Strahd himself. The Hickmans had been inspired by a daguerreotype photo of a man with piercing eyes, and so Strahd went from the Christopher Lee Dracula to the debutante we see on Curse of Strahd's cover. While the balance of who wrote or designed what is obviously pretty hard to tell, you can't deny that the adventure is really saturated with the gothic horror and impressive visuals that made the original so successful. To blend together what people seem to enjoy best over the years, they also went for an adaptation approach, not looking to make a sequel paying heavy reference to 80 plus other books at every turn. The result is Curse of Strahd. It pulled together the classic feel of Ravenloft with the expanded lands of Barovia and a new web of quests and adventures. The exciting hook of the domains of Dread and their strange half-real, half-fake populations made for a perfect way to introduce new players, no matter what kind of game they were in before. Plus, the Taroka deck added an exciting element of random chance that had long sustained the original. Rudolf von Richten stood alongside a few other cameos, including Mordenkainen, who was sequestered off on some ill-fated quest. The adventure was praised for returning to the form of the original and offering a wide-open expanse of options in an open-world adventure. 5th edition had needed a sound adventure to jumpstart its early years, and Curse of Strahd had fit the bill. Although, to be fair, Critical Role had also hit its second year, and Stranger Things was only 3 months away, so success seemed almost preordained. Curse of Strahd is a great blend of old and new elements of D&D. While it has a more modern approach, it still sports isometric maps and towns stacked to the brim with encounters and Easter eggs. It dedicates healthy blocks of time to combat, exploration, and social situations. Plus, it doesn't keep the game on rails. That kind of balance can be hard to maintain, and the book doesn't always do it perfectly. RIP to the victims of Old Bone Grinder. But it still holds a spot as one of the best adventures for D&D alongside the original Ravenloft. The horror fantasy can be played as a terrifying sprint through a haunted land, or even a campy summer slasher better suited for a casual hangout. There's even some versions meant to be played in a single night. If that grabs your interest, take a peek at Strahd Must Die tonight. So this Halloween, if you're looking for an adventure, take a crack at Curse of Strahd, a slice of D&D history wrapped in a gothic story of love, murder, and vampires.